then held on to win, only to run out of fuel on the slowing down lap. At the Japanese Grand Prix of 1988, Ayrton Senna needed victory at Suzuka to claim his first world championship. But, as the lights went out, he stalled his McLaren, sliding backwards down the grid before the slope of the track allowed him to bump start the engine and rejoin near the back. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the race for victory had already been decided, but the fight for second place became the stuff of legend. Gilles Villeneuve, in his Ferrari, and René Arnoux, in his Renault, battled wheel to wheel over the closing laps at Dijon. They banged wheels, ran side by side through the corners, and swapped positions again and again in a display of pure, fearless racing. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell found himself trailing his own Williams teammate, Nelson Piquet, by nearly half a minute. Roared on by a passionate home crowd, Mansell hunted him down lap after lap, breaking the circuit record time and again. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, the daunting Nürburgring claimed its most famous victim. Niki Lauda, the reigning world champion, crashed his Ferrari in the wet, and the car burst into flames. Trapped in the inferno, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes, and a priest was called to read him his last rites. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the closing laps at Dijon produced one of the greatest duels the sport has ever seen. At the Monaco Grand Prix of 1988, Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that has become the stuff of myth. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda's Ferrari crashed and burst into flames on the daunting Nürburgring. Trapped in the burning wreck, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes that left him fighting for his life. A priest was called to read him his last rites, yet Lauda refused to give in. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet by nearly 30 seconds at Silverstone. Yet driving before his adoring home crowd, Mansell mounted a relentless pursuit, breaking lap records again and again. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the race for the win was settled early, but the battle for second place would become legend. Over the final laps at Dijon, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel to wheel, banging tires and refusing to yield. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily on the fearsome Nürburgring, his Ferrari bursting into flames. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet, and a home crowd willed him forward. At Monaco in 1988, Ayrton Senna produced one of the greatest qualifying laps ever seen.
Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the little flap that gives drivers a speed boost.
Sam jumping in when it.
Right, and they can only use it in special zones when they're close behind another car. It's there to help overtaking. Alex here. Let's talk about ground effect, the invisible force sucking these cars to the track.
Sam jumping in. The floor is shaped so air speeds up underneath, and faster air means lower pressure down there.
Right, so the higher pressure on top basically pushes the car down onto the road. No big wings needed.
So it's like a vacuum hugging the tarmac, giving them grip through corners without piling on loads of drag.
Alex here. Let's talk about tire degradation. Why a car that flies early can fade so fast.
Sam jumping in. As the rubber heats up and wears, it loses grip, so those glorious lap times start slipping away.
Right, and there are different compounds. Softs are quick but wear out sooner. Hards last longer but take time to switch on.
So it's a bit like running shoes. The grippier ones feel amazing but shred quicker, and managing that is half the strategy.
Alex here. Let's chat about DRS, that little flap on the rear wing that helps cars overtake.
Sam jumping in. When a driver's close enough behind, they can open that flap on straights, and it flattens out the wing.
Right, and a flatter wing means less drag, so the car punches through the air easier and picks up extra speed. Alex here. Let's talk about ground effect, the clever way F1 cars suck themselves to the track.
Sam jumping in. The floor of the car is shaped so air speeds up underneath it, creating low pressure that pulls the car down.
Right, and that downforce means more grip through corners without the drag you'd get from big wings.
So it's like a vacuum cleaner glued to the road. The faster you go, the harder it sticks.
Alex here. Let's talk about ERS, the electric power boost hidden inside these cars.
Sam jumping in. The car actually harvests energy that normally be wasted, like heat from braking, and stores it in a battery.
Right, and then the driver deploys it for a punch of extra horsepower down the straights.
So it's like a hybrid road car, but supercharged. Recycle the energy, then unleash it when you need to attack. Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the driver's little overtaking helper on the straights.
Sam jumping in. It stands for drag reduction system, and it opens a flap in the rear wing to let air flow straight through.
Right, and with less drag, the car slices through the air faster and picks up top speed.
So it's like tucking your elbows in on a bike. Open that flap, cut the resistance, and pounce on the car ahead. Alex here. Let's talk about tire degradation. Why these tires just fall off a cliff sometimes.
Sam jumping in. As the rubber heats up and wears down lap after lap, it loses grip and the lap times start creeping up.
Right, and teams pick from different compounds. Softer ones are faster but wear quicker. Harder ones last longer but grip less.
So, it's like choosing running shoes. Grippy racing spikes wear out fast, or tougher trainers that go the distance. It's all about the trade-off. Alex here. Let's talk about ground effect, the invisible force sucking these cars into the track.
Sam jumping in. Underneath the floor there are shaped tunnels, and as air rushes through them fast, it drops in pressure and pulls the car down.
Right, and that downforce lets them fly through corners without adding drag up top, like big wings would.
So it's like a vacuum cleaner gliding across the floor. The faster the air moves underneath, the harder it clings to the ground. Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, that little flap on the rear wing that opens up to help overtaking.
Sam jumping in. When a driver's close enough behind, they can open that flap, and it lets air slip through, cutting drag down the straights.
Right. Less drag means more top speed, so they can slingshot up alongside the car in front.
So it's like ducking down low on a bicycle. Tuck out of the wind, and suddenly you're flying that bit faster.
On a rain-soaked afternoon at the Nürburgring in 1976, Niki Lauda's Ferrari crashed and burst into flames. He was trapped in the fire for close to a minute and suffered severe burns along with damage to his lungs. Yet just 6 weeks later, bandages still covering his scars, he climbed back into the car at Monza and finished fourth. It remains one of the bravest comebacks the sport has ever witnessed. At the British Grand Prix in 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate Nelson Piquet by a considerable margin. A tyre stop dropped him further back, yet he charged through the field, breaking the lap record time and again. On the very last lap, he sold Piquet a dummy into Stowe and swept through to a home victory that sent the crowd wild. So many spectators poured onto the track afterwards that Mansell had to weave through them on his slowing down lap. At Suzuka in 1988, Ayrton Senna needed to win to claim his first world championship. But as the lights went out, he stalled and slipped back to around 14th place as the field streamed past him. On a track dampened by drizzle, he carved his way through the pack with breathtaking precision, hunting down his own teammate, Alain Prost. He took the lead, held on to the flag, and was crowned champion for the very first time. At the French Grand Prix in 1979, the race for victory belonged to Jean-Pierre Jabouille and his turbocharged Renault. But behind him, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought one of the greatest duels the sport has ever seen. Over the closing laps, they banged wheels, ran side by side, and swapped positions again and again, refusing to yield an inch. At the Nürburgring in 1976, Niki Lauda was leading the World Championship when disaster struck on the second lap. His Ferrari veered off, struck the barrier, and burst into flames, trapping him in the burning wreck. Fellow drivers dragged him from the fire, but he had already suffered terrible burns and inhaled toxic fumes. Astonishingly, just 6 weeks later, he returned to racing at Monza, his wounds still healing beneath the bandages. At the British Grand Prix in 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate Nelson Piquet by a considerable margin. Driving before his home crowd, Mansell threw everything at the chase, setting lap after blistering lap to close the gap. On the final tour, he sold Piquet a dummy at Stowe and swept past to take a famous victory. At Suzuka in 1988, Ayrton Senna needed victory to claim his first world championship. But as the lights went out, his engine faltered and he very nearly stalled on the grid. The slope of the circuit saved him, letting the car roll and fire back into life, yet he had dropped down to 14th. In treacherous rain, he carved through the field, catching his teammate Alain Prost and sweeping to the title in one of the great comebacks. At the German Grand Prix in 1976, the Nürburgring's Nordschleife claimed one of its most terrifying moments. But on lap 64, at nearly 180 miles per hour, his left rear tire exploded in a shower of sparks. At Imola in 1994, the San Marino Grand Prix became the darkest weekend in the sport's modern history. On lap 7, Ayrton Senna's Williams left the track at the Tamburello corner and struck the concrete wall at high speed. At the German Grand Prix in 1976, Niki Lauda crashed on the treacherous Nürburgring, his Ferrari bursting into flames. Trapped in the inferno, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes, and a priest was called to read him his last rites. Yet, just 6 weeks later, scarred and still bandaged, he astonished the world by returning to race at Monza. His courage became one of the most remarkable comeback stories the sport has ever known. At the British Grand Prix in 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet by nearly half a minute. Driving before his adoring home crowd at Silverstone, he launched a furious pursuit, setting a string of blistering laps. With just 3 laps remaining, he produced a stunning dummy at Stowe Corner to sweep past Piquet and take the lead. At Imola in 1994, Formula One endured its darkest weekend. During the San Marino Grand Prix, Ayrton Senna, leading the race in his Williams, crashed heavily at the Tamburello corner. The 3-time world champion, revered as one of the greatest to ever drive, lost his life that day. His death shook the sport to its core and ushered in a new era of safety that changed Formula One forever. At the German Grand Prix in 1976, Niki Lauda crashed his Ferrari on the daunting Nürburgring. His car burst into flames, and he was trapped in the inferno for agonizing seconds before fellow drivers pulled him free. He suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes, and at one point, a priest read him his last rites.
Alex here. Let's talk about DRS, the drag reduction system. Sam, what's actually happening back there?
Well, Alex, there's a flap in the rear wing that flips open when the driver presses a button in a designated zone.
All right, let's look ahead to the action from Spa-Francorchamps.
Practice 1 gets us rolling Friday at 11:30 UTC. That's 07:30 ET and 13:30 in Madrid, with Practice 2 following at 1500 UTC.
Then, we're back Saturday for Practice 3 at 10:30 UTC. Hit subscribe so you don't miss a moment. See you trackside. Sam here. Let's talk tire degradation, because those slicks don't last forever.
Right, Alex. As a tire works, the rubber heats up, and over the laps, it wears down and loses grip.
And there's
On the 1st of August, 1976, Niki Lauda crashed his Ferrari at the fearsome Nürburgring, the car bursting into flames. He was trapped in the inferno for close to a minute, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes that scarred his lungs. Astonishingly, he returned to racing just 6 weeks later, his wounds still fresh, to fight for the championship. At the final round of 1986 in Adelaide, Nigel Mansell needed only 3rd place to seal the World Championship. But with around 20 laps to go, his left rear tire exploded at nearly 300 km/h down the main straight. Sparks flew as he wrestled the car to a halt, his title hopes vanishing in an instant. The crown went instead to Alain Prost, a cruel end to a season Mansell had so nearly won. At Suzuka, in 1988, Ayrton Senna needed to win to claim his first world championship. But as the lights went out, he stalled his McLaren, dropping down towards the back of the field. What followed was a masterclass, as he carved his way through the pack in changing conditions to take the lead. He crossed the line first, securing the title and confirming his place among the sport's greatest talents. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, held at Dijon, the fight for second place produced one of the greatest duels in the sport's history. Gilles Villeneuve in his Ferrari and René Arnoux in the Renault battled wheel to wheel over the closing laps. They banged wheels, ran side by side through the corners, and swapped places again and again, neither man willing to yield. At the Nürburgring in 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily during the German Grand Prix, his Ferrari bursting into flames. Trapped in the burning wreckage, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes, and for a time, his life hung in the balance. Yet, astonishingly, just 6 weeks later, he returned to racing, his wounds still raw beneath his helmet. His courage that season became one of the most extraordinary tales of determination the sport has ever known. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate, Nelson Piquet, by a considerable margin. Driving before his adoring home crowd, Mansell threw everything at the chase, setting a string of blistering laps. With just a few laps remaining, he sold Piquet a dummy into Stowe and swept past to take a famous victory. He crossed the line, ran out of fuel, and the Silverstone faithful poured onto the track to celebrate their hero. At Monaco in 1988, Ayrton Senna delivered a qualifying lap that seemed to belong to another world. He was nearly a second and a half faster than his own teammate, Alain Prost, in an identical car. Senna later described entering a trance-like state, driving on pure instinct, as if the circuit had opened itself to him. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the crowd witnessed one of the greatest battles the sport has ever seen. In the closing laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel to wheel for second place, banging tires and refusing to yield. They swapped positions again and again, sometimes running side by side through the corners, on the very edge of control. Villeneuve held on to claim the place, and the two rivals embraced afterwards, having earned each other's lasting respect. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate, Nelson Piquet, more than half a minute adrift. Yet with the home crowd roaring him on, he began to reel Piquet in, lap after relentless lap. With a daring dummy at Stowe, Mansell swept past to take the lead, and the grandstands erupted. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily on the daunting Nürburgring. His Ferrari burst into flames, and he was trapped in the inferno, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes. A priest was called to read him his last rites, yet Lauda clung to life with astonishing willpower. Just 6 weeks later, still scarred and bandaged, he returned to racing at Monza, one of sport's greatest acts of courage. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, held at Dijon, the crowd witnessed one of the fiercest duels the sport has ever seen. On the final laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel to wheel, banging tires and refusing to yield an inch. They swapped positions again and again, running side by side through the corners, neither man willing to lift. Villeneuve held on for second place, and the two rivals embraced afterwards, having thrilled a generation of fans. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate, Nelson Piquet, by a considerable margin. Driving before his adoring home crowd, Mansell launched a relentless charge, hunting down the leader, lap after lap. With a brilliant dummy into stow, he swept past Piquet and roared to a famous victory. At Monaco in 1988, Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that seemed to belong to another dimension. He beat his own teammate, Alain Prost, by a staggering margin, later describing an almost trance-like state behind the wheel. But in the race, holding a commanding lead, he lost concentration and clipped the barrier at Poitiers. Senna walked back to his apartment, devastated. A painful lesson from the greatest talent of his generation. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the crowd witnessed one of the most thrilling duels the sport has ever known. In the closing laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel-to-wheel for second place, banging tyres and running side by side through the corners. They swapped positions, again and again, refusing to yield an inch, driving with breathtaking courage and abandon. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily on the long and treacherous Nürburgring. His Ferrari burst into flames, and he was trapped in the burning wreck, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes. A priest was called to give him the last rites, yet Lauda refused to surrender. Astonishingly, just 6 weeks later, he returned to racing, his bandages still fresh, in one of sport's greatest acts of courage. At Monaco in 1988, Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that seemed to belong to another dimension. He beat his own teammate, Alain Prost, by nearly a second and a half around the narrow streets, later saying he had felt as though he were driving on instinct alone, beyond his own conscious control. Yet in the race, while leading comfortably, he lost concentration and clipped the barrier at Poitiers, ending his afternoon in the wall. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet by a considerable margin at his home circuit of Silverstone. With the crowd roaring him on, Mansell hunted down the leader lap after lap, producing a legendary dummy at Stowe Corner to seize the lead. On the 1st of August, 1976, Niki Lauda crashed catastrophically on the daunting Nürburgring. His Ferrari burst into flames, and he was trapped in the inferno, suffering severe burns and inhaling toxic fumes that scarred his lungs. A priest was called to administer the last rites as he lay in hospital, so grave were his injuries. Yet Lauda would defy every expectation, and the world had not yet seen the last of him. Just 6 weeks after the priest had read him his last rites, Niki Lauda returned to the cockpit at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. His burns were still raw, and blood seeped through the bandages beneath his helmet as he drove. Yet he summoned extraordinary courage and finished fourth, an astonishing act of will that defied medicine and reason alike. It remains one of the bravest comebacks the sport has ever witnessed. The 1976 season reached its climax at the Japanese Grand Prix, held at Fuji Speedway in torrential rain. Niki Lauda, still recovering from his terrible burns, led James Hunt by just 3 points in the championship. Yet, after only 2 laps, Lauda chose to withdraw, deciding that no title was worth risking his life in such treacherous conditions. Hunt battled on to finish third, seizing the World Championship by a single point in one of the sport's most dramatic finales. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, held at Dijon-Prenois, the race produced a battle that would become legend. On the final laps, Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought wheel to wheel, their cars touching again and again. They swapped positions repeatedly, sliding through corners side by side with reckless, thrilling abandon. Villeneuve held on for second place, and their duel is still remembered as one of the greatest in the history of the sport. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his own teammate Nelson Piquet by nearly 30 seconds. Rolled on by a passionate home crowd, Mansell began a relentless charge, setting lap record after lap record. On the pit straight, he sold Piquet an outrageous dummy, darting one way then the other to sweep into the lead. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda crashed heavily on the daunting Nürburgring, his Ferrari bursting into flames. Trapped in the burning wreckage, he suffered severe burns and inhaled toxic fumes that scarred his lungs. A priest was called to give him the last rites, yet Lauda refused to surrender to death. Just 6 weeks later, bandaged and in agony, he returned to racing at Monza, an act of courage that defied belief. At the French Grand Prix of 1979, the race for victory was decided, but the battle for second place became legend. Gilles Villeneuve and René Arnoux fought over the final laps, banging wheels and refusing to yield an inch. They ran side by side, sparks flying, each overtaking the other again and again in a display of raw, fearless courage. At the British Grand Prix of 1992, Nigel Mansell arrived at Silverstone at the peak of his powers. Driving the dominant Williams Renault, he took pole position and led from start to finish before an adoring home crowd. As he crossed the line, thousands of fans poured onto the track in celebration, mobbing their hero in scenes never to be forgotten. At the German Grand Prix of 1976, Niki Lauda faced the daunting Nürburgring, a circuit he had feared and campaigned against. On the second lap, his Ferrari crashed and burst into flames, trapping him amid the searing heat before fellow drivers dragged him free. Suffering terrible burns and damaged lungs, he was given the last rites, yet he refused to surrender to his injuries. At the Monaco Grand Prix of 1988, Ayrton Senna produced a qualifying lap that seemed to defy reason. He took pole position by nearly a second and a half over his own teammate, Alain Prost, in an identical car. At the British Grand Prix of 1987, Nigel Mansell trailed his teammate Nelson Piquet some distance behind on home soil at Silverstone.
Let's talk about something you hear every lap but rarely see: brake temperature.
Right, Alex. Those carbon brake discs actually need to be hot to work properly, often glowing bright orange.
So it's a balance.